Welcome to episode 14 of the Argue With Me podcast. In this episode, I speak with Jack Lloyd, voluntarist and committed anarcho-capitalist. We discuss his newest book with his wife called The Unschooled Adventures of Jack and We go into why somebody might want to participate in unschooling and how you don't necessarily have to be a libertarian to get value from a book like that. Problems with the public school system, incentives around it, and even the basis for Jack's belief in voluntary society and anarcho-capitalism in particular. I hope that you'll enjoy the podcast. Thank you. All right, welcome to the Argue With Me podcast. I'm super excited to have with me a guy with incredible energy all the time, actually, Jack Lloyd. Jack Lloyd is a voluntarist. Are you a voluntarist or voluntaryist preference guy?
Voluntarist, because it's voluntary.
Yeah.
The word meaning, of course, having consent and
Yes.
Being of your free will, and then ist, which ties in their being of an ideology. So combining those two parts.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So like this is but as opposed to like a volunteerist who's somebody who's just really excited about volunteering for different stuff.
Right.
Okay, I see.
Wants to volunteer. That's a big difference.
Okay, understood.
Yeah.
All right. So in this episode, Jack and I are going to have conversations about a bunch of different stuff. There's no overarching theme except all of it's going to have to do with liberty, obviously, libertarianism. But I wanted to get into the thing that made me reach out to you first, actually, which is your upcoming book, which you'll doubtlessly want to tell us about, The Unschooled Adventures of Jack and Foe. So can you show the people at home, what are we talking about?
It's
There we go.
beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is me and my wife decide to make our first children's book. I have a comic book series, but it's a little more mature content. This is actually more of a kid's book. And one of the things that we're really passionate about is helping families leave the compulsory schooling setting, especially, of course, in public schools, where people are forced to do things by the government hour by hour. And they're told, if you don't learn these topics and these divided orders to the tune of a bell, that you're just going to be dumb and you're going to work at McDonald's and all this other nonsense. And so we want to help people get out of that programming and think about what a libertarian or voluntarist educational framework and mindset looks like. So our book, The Unschooled Adventures of Jack and Pho, introduces this world of these two characters and their exploration of an unschooling cooperative center, which in many ways is not exactly like it, but you can think of it like the Sudbury Valley School model, which is a school that's been around since 1968 in Framingham, Massachusetts. It has some different features from it, but it's in that genre. The idea that there's actually a meetup place where young people are free to learn and choose whatever it is they're doing. They're just living life, and adults are there acting as facilitators of learning. That is, they're there to just be resources. They're not there to say, you have to do this by this hour. They're not using threats, shame, or ultimatums, or grading them forcibly. Young people are free to choose. And that freedom to choose, in reality, unlike what a lot of the people in the controlling statist mindset think, actually fosters curiosity and learning about the world. And when young people are free to engage with the tools of the culture and they have their own self-directed interests, they pick up numeracy and arithmetic, and they pick up reading and writing when they're doing these things because they're curious about the world. They pick it up, and then adults, if they have questions, and adults can help them with whatever. And if a young person wants to take a class, as long as they're choosing to take a class, totally fine, right? So unschooling is not the rejection of textbooks at all, or the rejection of any type of controlled learning where it's sequential or something like that. It's just that a young person is choosing what it is that they'd like to do, and they're building their fundamental skills of understanding the world based on those self-directed interests.
Yeah, that's great. Like, so my wife and I, we homeschool our child. Now I'm a Canadian. I live in Ottawa. The homeschool population here is, I think, basically us and 5 other people. All right. So the idea of having like an actual, a communal place where people of like mind could go is foreign to me. This is just sort of homeschooling is something we've done sort of out of desperation, not really overly for overly political reasons, although sometimes that's the case. It's more so that, as you pointed out in that pitch, we've just noticed that kids come out of school knowing nothing. And often worse than nothing, right? They just don't have a concept of how the actual world works. And surely somebody who's a big fan of public school will guffaw at that statement and go, "Oh no, public school, that's how the world works." And it's like, well, until you get a job and then you realize, oh no, I have to think for myself and I have to be able to add and read. And it doesn't seem like kids that come out of state-sponsored schools can do those things. So, like, I can see value in what you're talking about for people who are liberty minded, but I can also just see value in it for anybody who wants their kid to know how to do math or pursue an interest or just be self-directed. What do
Yeah,
you think?
it was fundamentally, as many people, obviously know when they're asked to self-reflect, they didn't stop learning the moment that they graduate high school or college. It wasn't like, oh, I guess you're done. You'll never have to learn anything again. You'll never have to self-direct your learning or pick up something new, because that's only going to take place inside a classroom, right? It's kind of ridiculous when you frame it that way, but people kind of come at it with that mentality that the only place and way you can learn is if you're told what to do hour by hour for years by a set of authority, and they're the ones that need to tell you exactly what to know. And of course, it's ludicrous when you look
Yeah,
at
it's
real life
when
and you're like, wait, I have to learn on the fly for anything that I'm interested in doing, any new technology or information or whatever. So
absolutely. So, like, something I notice with new hires in the field that I'm in, which I don't want to get into too much, but they often really lack the ability to answer questions they have on their own. Instead of looking up a YouTube video, even, which would be better, or just spending an hour reading, they will go ask somebody every time. Which is, everybody needs some help sometimes, and I understand that. But I feel like kids that come out of the public school system are totally lacking the ability to actually self-direct when it comes to figuring anything out. Now, did you go to public school or did you go to were you homeschooled or?
So for me, I had a quite interesting experience. So I want to go back even before myself. My dad was a 30-year New York City school teacher. He was a career school teacher, and I got to see a lot of things, that went on there when he taught at a middle school. And it was, more of the ghetto middle school where they had metal detectors and stuff like that back in the 80s. So
Mm,
quite the rough experience. I myself only went to a public school for kindergarten, and then I went to 4 different private schools past that. I went to a public, as in state, university past that, and then I went to another state university for law school. And then later on, I was a juvenile defense attorney who, of course, worked with kids and got to see what they did educationally within a prison, a real prison environment. And then
yeah.
I also was a substitute teacher and full-time public school teacher where I taught high school. And then I also taught at a K-8 charter school for a few years. So I've had quite the gamut
Yeah.
of seeing education in many different lenses, with my dad's experience, my experience at public private school, my experience as substitute teacher across a bunch of different schools, charter school, public school. I mean, you name it. And then I own a tutoring company as well. And, I did tutoring as well after, beyond that. So, and I tutored kids from multiple different states and all that kind of stuff. So I've seen the full gamut, right? I really have gotten to
Yeah.
see it from many different sides and many different angles, and the worst of things and the best of things, and everything in between. So that's kind of what inspired my thinking, especially seeing how it destroys, that is, the process destroys young people's creativity and self-drive, because eventually you just come out and they can't do anything on their own because they're so used to being told, here's what you need to do. And you need to wait on authority to tell you what to do. And if you go outside of that, then you're in trouble. And if you're doing something else, like reading a book that you're not supposed to be reading, you're supposed to be reading this, then you're in trouble. So it's completely destructive. And then,
No,
yeah, as you
I'm having
mentioned,
flashbacks.
right.
So I went to a public school for my entire, till the end of high school. And boy, I have several university degrees. I have no problem learning. Psychologically fairly normal person. Here's what I remember the most from high school. I couldn't wait to get out of high school to go home to read things I actually cared about. Like, that's what I spent all my time doing. I would sit there drawing when the teacher couldn't see me, drawing things I cared about and waiting to go home to read things I cared about. And all of the things I cared about have served me better in my adult life than anything in high school would have. So anyway, I just intuitively, I think you're on the right track here, and I hope people will check the book out and in general consider this. I mean, we're getting into weird territory with public school discussions, to the point that people think it's like abuse to pull your child out of public school. I've seen that in Canada. I think I've seen a little bit of it in the United States as well. Um, what would you say, like if we had somebody here right now who thought that it was abusive to take your kid, you're really doing them a disservice. What would you, I mean, I know you'd never convince that person. What would you say to a person like that?
Yeah, I mean, usually when someone's saying that it's abuse, they're focusing on probably the worst examples of homeschoolers where it's like some type of very abusive, toxic, maybe it's a religious fundamentalism thing or something else where they imagine these kids are like being beat and all this other stuff and they have no social, experiences whatsoever. They like lock them in a room, like some type of, movie stereotype, a Hollywood stereotype of that. And does that happen? Of course, there's situations like that. Is that the overwhelming majority of those situations? Of course not. But what's the compared to what? What is school actually doing, right? In school, the abuse and the bullying and the toxicity is guaranteed, right? Homeschooling is the possibility there might be abuse. Public school is the guarantee of it. In fact, in American schools, there's a 2005 study that showed 1 in 10 students will experience some form of sexual abuse or harassment by some member of the faculty by the time they get through their K to 12 years. Bullying is rampant through and through, right? Because the environment that is created in a schooling environment where they have the different grades and classes, they create this hierarchy, an artificial one, of course, where people are pitted against each other, and there's like, oh, the upperclassmen, think they're better than the underclassmen, and there's this lack of empathy because everyone's fighting for attention, and they're like, oh, only the kids with good grades get treated right, and if you don't have good grades, then you're worthless, and you don't deserve to go on the trips, you don't deserve to get the accolades and all this other stuff. It's about obedience. So the psychology of the environment fosters the bullying, and inherently so, because the teachers there are trying to get kids to perform, go through these hoops no matter what. Like at the end of the day, the goal of a teacher is like, I need these kids to perform for me, and I'm going to do whatever it takes with shame, threats, ultimatums, taking things away from kids and whatever it is so that they turn in their work, pass the test, get whatever they need to do so that they signal that, oh, the teacher did a good job. So inherently, public school is a very violent environment on multiple fronts. The toxicity among students that's fostered by it, the toxicity of teachers and the shaming and the grading and the hierarchy of pitting kids against each other over superficial things. It's absolutely terrible. And then, of course, there is still, as you can imagine, schools are not exactly drug-free, gun-free, sexual violence free in terms of the possibilities of violence, right? I'm not saying, gun free as the guns are bad. I'm just saying that there's, you can have violence in schools.
Well, guns can be bad.
Right. But guns can be used for bad things. Exactly.
Yeah.
In a gang warfare kind of, it's like as if, oh, that never happens, right? You go into a school and you're never bullied. There's never any risks. There's never any traumas, right? It's just absurd, right? It's absolutely patently absurd. And you have gradations again at different schools. You might have the nicest white liberal elite schools in Massachusetts might be, relatively squeaky clean, but that doesn't describe your average public school, right? From students' experiences, it's not exactly, that little insular, rich kid town where, it's zoned for the wealthy families, that kind of thing, which is its own legal history. And that's its own wild discussion that goes into why people did busing and all sort of stuff. But the point being is that, the idea that schools are just somehow this like safe place psychologically and physically for students is just abject nonsense. The inherent structure of it is meant to be authoritarian, controlling, pitting kids against each other, and skipping over bullying and healthy social behaviors because fundamentally they have to get kids to obey, and that takes precedence over everything. You know what I mean? You can't do emotional.
Well, it does, yeah. And also, maybe what if there's anything that would take precedence over that, it would be just, at least here in Ontario again, they have a curriculum. They can't deviate from it. They're not really allowed to comment on the curriculum. And by the way, uh, I don't mean anything again like overtly nefariously political by this. I just mean that for a while, like we had our daughter in this online school that was organized by the Ottawa School Board, and the amount of learning that she did, and this is when, we can supervise things, and we got my wife in the same room and whatever. The amount of learning she did per hour was nothing. Like they had to go over things that were far below what a child is actually capable of doing. Um, you know, concentrating too much on shapes, for example. Like how many times do you need to see a square even when you're 4 before you know it's a square? That sort of thing. We just thought it would stunt her growth if we followed the curriculum, right? So, like, yes, there's this object of control, and there's also well, this is the curriculum, and it's scientifically designed. But I find it's scientifically designed so that the slowest kid in the class can still do it, but that's not going to be good for everybody. And so I've always sort of found it to be an error on the parents' behalf in actually wondering what their child is capable of and whether they're being challenged. And maybe this is why people are coming out unable to do simple things, is it's just no one's ever really asked them to do it. Or I don't know if it's the same sort of thing, if like in the state of New York or Florida, if there's a public curriculum and it can't be deviated from and it's the lowest common denominator. Do you see that type of thing?
It depends on which type of class that you're in, because I've seen it all, lowest common denominator, and also pushing to do more than what kids are capable of doing. Because fundamentally, when it comes to the system, right, it's one size fits all, right? Everyone's
Yeah.
going along the same progression, but human biology and human intelligence is not one size fits all. Every kid is developing at different paces, even if they're in the same year. A boy is developing and his brain is developing at a different pace than many other girls. And even within boys, there's going to be kids who mature a little faster, kids who take a little longer, but that doesn't make them behind just because their body developed at a different point. The schooling system labels everybody by this one size fits all policy as behind based on something that is arbitrary and just made up. It's illusory. It's not, there is no such thing as, oh, a kid has to learn this much by 8 or they're behind, or 9 they're behind, right? It's just
Yeah.
it's completely made up out of whole cloth. These particular standards. So fundamentally, what you'll get usually one of those types of biases. You might have catering to the lowest common denominator, or, and I've seen this being in honors class and stuff like that and teaching that, you'll see that they throw everything at these kids. They're like, we got to show them the world. And they throw like a million different math concepts. And I'm sitting here like, yeah, this is more appropriate for a college level student who has bigger picture thinking and has a few other fields mastered, but they're just throwing it at these kids, and these kids, they don't even know really what it means. Cause I would ask them, be like, so what does this mean? How does this apply? They can't explain it. They can just memorize the mechanics of it. They can memorize,
Right.
okay, this is the step I need to do, and that's that. But they don't understand what it means. They're just doing it.
Yeah, I've experienced this
You know?
myself. I remember,
Yeah.
boy, you're bringing all kinds of stuff back in my memory. I haven't thought about it in a long time. I remember in, I don't know, grade 7 or something like this, there was a math class where we were doing, Pythagoras, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And I remember asking why. I was a kid, and I mean, it's apparent to me now, but like, why is that true? And the teacher could not answer. Like she genuinely couldn't, and she just told me. She's like, "Well, I got this book here, and that's what it says. So this is what you got to know." So I remembered the formula and had no idea how to prove it, or what a proof was.
Right.
Really, it would have been better to start. What is a proof? How do we even know anything, right?
Right.
And I wanted to say too, like, I was reading. I don't know if you know who Robert Sapolsky is, the neurobiologist. He wrote he released this book. I think it's called Determined. Anyway, and it's just a biological determinism is what it's about. And he cites some really interesting studies in it about how children who are unlucky enough to have birthdays that will leave them slightly younger than their cohort do worse in life. Despite the fact that they develop at exactly the same rate as their peers, if you're unlucky enough to always be, like I was always a little younger than everybody else in my grade by like 6 months or something like this, right? Dependent on the person, of course. And so that actually has biological implications. Like you said, it's a one size fits all. You're all in grade 10. Well, I'm half a year younger than everybody else. You're still in grade 10. Enjoy. Right? So
Right.
like I don't know. It's just I find everything you're telling me is copacetic with my experience.
Right. And again, the biology, of each individual is unique, and the brain is continuing to develop and making, these different types of synapse connections, into your mid-20s for many people. So, guaranteed, if someone is, in the same grade, but they're 9 months different in terms of age, there's that potentiality, in addition to their, unique biology of having less development, right? Having someone gotten more experiences and having their brain develop more and having, more thoughts and things like that, just by virtue of time, right? Strengthening of time. So yeah, exactly. It's just, if you try to make one size fits all, you're going to fail everybody in the end, because there is no such thing as average when it comes to learning. Each person is going to be unique and different, and can't be measured by the same stick at the same time, especially in what is the most radically different and varied developmental years, right? We're not talking about fully formed adults, people who are at 30. We're talking about wide differences in biological developments, especially when you're dealing with young kids and prepubescent kids who are going through that process.
So now for your book, does somebody have to be a libertarian? It sounds like you don't even have to be a libertarian to enjoy this book.
No, yeah. I mean, the ethos of Unschooling is certainly a very voluntarist philosophy, undoubtedly. And it becomes difficult that if you actually embrace unschooling conceptually, it becomes difficult to not be like, actually, shouldn't this apply everywhere else? But there's certainly people who are unschoolers who have different worldviews or economic views, and I've seen it. And sometimes I push back on those people and try to challenge their thinking, especially people who are in the democratic side of things, because certainly Sudbury Valley is more democratic, and they're into that kind of democracy thing, the papal kind of thing. And
Sure.
My book doesn't deal with democracy. It's a non-democratic form of unschooling, because certainly democracy cannot make right or ethical. It's more so about consensus based things, and fundamental rights and wrongs. But yeah, anyone who just is skeptical of the compulsory schooling model and themselves feels frustrated by it and is looking for something that is like, what is actually helping young people be free to learn and foster their innate curiosities, and gets them out of this, fear-based mindset of control, which is something that actually I'd say most adults have to undo for themselves. For unschooling, It's less the kids sometimes, especially if they haven't been to school or been there long. It's more the adults getting out of the fear and getting themselves out of the, oh my gosh, I need to control my child and make them learn this particular, level of vocabulary by this age, or I'm a failure as a parent, that kind of thing. So there's a deschooling aspect for the adults as well, especially if they were heavily schooled.
Yeah. Well, adults, pardon me, excuse me, to edit that out later. Maybe not. The adults, they if they grew up in the public school system, and especially depending on the line of work they get into, they might never sort of exercise these muscles that you're talking about, and that type of person might never even trip over your book or give it a second thought. But I do think there's probably a huge amount of people who are unhappy with public schools the way they are, who are unsure about what they even think about unschooling or that type of thing. And then this would be valuable to them to figure out, do I believe in this or the democratic version of this or that type of thing. So I mean, I would recommend that anybody thinking about that would pick up a copy to find out what's your pitch about this, right? So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. It's certainly, not exhaustive on everything, because it's an expanding universe and it's setting the framework and the backdrop. But it's a great introduction for sure. And if someone wanted to get more details on the real world, because again, this is a fictional book, well, certainly, inspired from the real world on many of the topics. The Unschooling Primer by Carrie McDonald, which is Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom, is a fantastic read. She's a Foundation for Economic Education fellow. She's herself an unschooling parent of 4, master's degree from Harvard. She's certainly one to look at who has done the work of visiting all the different alt-ed.
Was she the one that had her she put her kid on a subway or something like this?
No, that's Lenore. I always forget the last name, Skenazy or Skazy.
Okay.
That's a different woman. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Maybe she just wrote about it then. Okay. Yeah. So Carrie McDonald.
Yeah, Carrie McDonald is, my opinion, one of the leading scholarly researchers on alt-ed and unschooling, and she's actively out there doing the work. She goes around to different centers and does interviews and research and showcases all these different alternative educational systems, and is written about it. So.
All right, so you just made a really nice segue in the middle of all of that. That hey, let's find out about the rest of the world. So your voluntarist adventures don't end at unschooling. In fact, they've just begun in that department. You've got a body of work going back about uh, uh, voluntarism. Some years. Do you want to plug? What's you have the definitive guide, don't you? You're the guy that wrote it. You got the definitive one.
Right.
Right.
This right here, The Definitive Guide to Libertarian Voluntarism. This is my first nonfiction book. I wrote it because I didn't find one particular resource that kind of defined the core principles and defended them in a philosophical way that anybody could readily pick up and understand. I found that there was too many different books that either were too long and too economically just purely oriented, or the philosophical books that might have touched on some of these things didn't really have strong definitions. They didn't have, in my opinion, consistent definitions. So I decided to take my many years of learning and research and my academic background and create a book that anybody could pick up, read, get the core principles of liberty, ground themselves in it, and then of course with further citation here, they can go deeper and look at deeper issues in economics or other histories and things like that. Certainly it is chock full of my own writing, analysis, and framings. So some people even make books and they're just quoting other people. My book doesn't do that. My book is all my own independent framings and analysis, picking up on some of the good of what others have written. As you can see, there's many greats on the front cover here. But I thought that there was better ways to articulate and frame the core definitions and unify people on them. So,
All right, so lay it on me. What are the principles? What are some of those principles you're talking about?
sure. Well, obviously, the two things you got to define are the two words in the cover, right? Libertarianism and voluntarism. So
Let's get into it. Let's start defining it.
Sure. So
Yeah.
I define libertarianism as the property rights ethic. So why that is because libertarianism stands out distinctly from other forms of economic theories and framings with socialists and communists and things like that, and people who are ancoms or ansocs. So libertarianism grounds this idea of private property rights ownership, starting with self-ownership, but then also extending to things like means of production and the ability to have rent and wages, right? Consensual relationships as among those, of course, but these types of property rights constructs are considered valid and ethical, as opposed to socialists and communists who would not view those things like being a landlord is ethical, or someone singularly owning the means of production.
Sure.
So very important to delineate libertarianism in that way from the rest of those ideologies. Then voluntarism is the study of the consent ethic, the idea that consent is what drives ethical human behavior, the idea that consent is something that you cannot wish to be violated logically, right? You cannot want your consent to be violated because the act of wanting is consent. So consent is what drives and meters ethical behavior, right? It's the difference between consensual sex and rape, right? The consent. It's the difference between having a boxing match and someone assaulting you and battering you on the street, right? You consent to a boxing match. It's like, okay, yes, we agree to this. That's okay. Someone public you on the street, not okay. Lacks consent, right? The same thing is, when you talk about giving someone a car, right? You can lend a friend your car and say, oh yeah, you can use my car to go get groceries or something like that. Consent. If they take it without your permission, they steal your keys. No consent, and that's carjacking. So that is unacceptable. So we understand readily in normal life, like it's not really that weird or strange. I'm not really doing anything that's that crazy here. Even kindergartners are told that you should respect other people, don't take their stuff, don't hit other kids, right? Obviously. But it gets lost when it gets to the political arena because suddenly the ideas of consent get lost when it's like, well, the government can do things that you couldn't do as an individual, even though you don't consent to it, right? With taxation, war, conscription, all this other stuff. Somehow magically mobs can make right something that's immoral for an individual to do, right? And so that's what it drives at is these two concepts, unifying them together, a theory of property rights, a theory of consent for metering ethical behavior as to the intersection of those property rights. And that's how we get libertarian voluntarism. And some also might call that anarcho-capitalism as well. But I focus on libertarian voluntarism to really focus on the root concepts of property rights and consent.
Yeah, see, I think you and I will probably agree on almost everything in the final analysis. I would have no worries if somebody said, "Hey, pick somebody to make a decision about public policy," and I found out it was you and you were a voluntarist, I would feel a lot better, right? Like then in
So.
yeah.
Right. So I'm wondering if we agree on like how to get there as an argument as to like why it's a good idea. And so I was just listening, I hope intently to what you were saying. It sounded like you were basing like the ethical framework on you can't agree to not give away your consent or something like you can't agree to give away your consent or disagree. How did you say that?
So
What was it?
you can't want your consent to be violated because the act of wanting is to consent. So you can't be like,
Right.
I wish someone would rape me. That's not
Right.
possible,
Right.
right? You
So
can't, if you
that's
want
sort
that.
of yeah, and that is factual. That's not
Right.
like that is
It's an
just factual.
oxymoron. It's an
Yeah.
oxymoron.
But I wonder like but I wouldn't use that as like an argument as to why consent is moral because then you'd just be it'd be circular, right? Because you'd be like, well, consent it's bad to violate consent, but you can't do it in this fashion. It's just not factually possible. So what would you do? But then you're starting really with like consent being violated being bad to start with anyway, right?
Right. So
So
that's the subjectivity of it. So in terms of in human terms, right? I'm looking at the nature of how people act and those minimums of how people express themselves, right? So the some people will talk about morality and say like, well, is this just imposed? Like, are you just asserting this? And I presented in my book is that it's a subjectively adopted position that is just performatively inescapable, right? No
interesting.
different
Okay.
than someone saying to you, I've never swam while they're swimming in a pool telling you they never swam, right? You could sit there and be like, okay, you say words, but you're acting in contradiction of that, right? In the same way that, someone can say, I don't have self-ownership or something like that, and yet they control their body. And if someone tries to do something, they'll stop them. They performatively contradict their words. Words, anyone can say anything, but
Okay.
they can't escape empirical physical realities, no matter what words they say.
So without freighting you with this baggage, that sounds almost like a Hoppian underpinning of the idea, right? That like just the mere act of being a voluntary person of arguing presupposes that I have um, uh, control of my body and that I can consent to this and that. And is that sort of what you're restating there?
No, actually,
No,
I'm different from Hoppe.
no,
Hoppe has
perfect. Yeah,
a
yeah.
very different framing, and I think that his framing is actually inapt and wrong. So he says if you make an argument, right, that is itself the preference of argument over violence and therefore property rights.
Yeah.
I actually don't take that because then again, all you have to do is if you do violence instead of argue, well, now you're preferring violence. So I don't think that actually holds up. That's called argumentation ethics. What I say instead is more so the performative contradiction that argument is the act of performatively suggesting existence. That to me is much more logically sound, right? So imagine someone says to you, oh, you don't exist, right? Everything is just whatever, but they're arguing to you about it, right? It would be a performative contradiction because they're treating you as if you exist and trying to convince your mind that oh yeah, you don't exist. But you're like, wait a second, but
Sure.
if I don't exist, why are you arguing with me as if I exist? Right? That's a performative contradiction, and that's something you can't escape from, right? So this gets where you get into those weird philosophical people, the nihilists and all this, the nihilists and all this stuff, and they're trying to be like, oh, everything is nothing and nothing, and it's just like, okay. And meanwhile, you're arguing as if I'm real and as if your words should be listened to and as if they matter, right? So you performatively contradict it. So the act of argument to me is the act of someone suggesting and believing in that they exist and other people exist to be reasoned with by performance of trying to do so.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So let me lay out really briefly why I like libertarianism or whatever you want to call it, anarcho-capitalism, um, which I think is just the most like internally consistent form of libertarianism. Um, it's for what I would call just instrumentalist reasons, right? So I have preferences. I like to live in a nice house in a safe neighborhood. I like to have a job. Actually, I actually mean that, by the way. I really like working. Some people just say they want to have a job because they want to have money, but no, I actually really like having a job. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. And I observe that, look, for a bunch of good reasons that economists have laid out, game theorists have laid out, um, in astonishing detail, that when we just let people proceed under the rubric of private property and consent is perfectly good place to mention that here. Things turn out a lot better. And by a lot, I mean like really a lot. Like it's not even close. If you look at countries that don't follow this or start to veer that way, they really rapidly get worse. And then countries that do follow this really rapidly get better. And the more they follow this, and I'll say up to an extreme, but I'll give a caveat in a second. It really seems to be an exponential increase in human well-being the closer they get to being a voluntarist society. Um, my trepidation comes at the end where and I don't know if this is really this is not an ethical problem with voluntarism. It's a game theoretic one, which is I'm not sure with the type of people we have on this planet right now that a voluntarist society is possible for very long before some jerk with a state with the state military comes to try to take it. Um, Now I know there's a lot of conversations about defense and provision of defense in a voluntary society, but I'm more so wondering, what do you think of like an instrumentalist, basically like me, that really, look, I'm not getting into ethics. It's not because I love voluntarism, but I think it's probably just correct if you want certain things, like a decent place to live.
So are you saying incrementalism? Like how do we get from A to B in terms of that?
No, no, not instrumentalism. So like the only reason I care about voluntarism is that it's an instrument for
Oh,
getting something good. Right?
sure.
Like if you could show me a better way of doing it tomorrow, I would dump voluntarism into the curb.
I
But you'd have to prove it to me. I wouldn't just like, oh, you've mentioned AI socialism to me.
right,
Okay, I'm off to the races now, right?
right.
Like, so I don't know. Your
So
your
yeah.
your framing of voluntarism, is it compatible with somebody like me who is just really interested in the results of it and preferences
So
being fulfilled?
right. That's just a form of consequentialism, utilitarianism, the idea that you don't care about the means to the end, that you just want to see a certain end. If that is where you're at, then that would be what that's called, consequentialist utilitarian.
Well, and not to cut you off, I really want to hear your opinion on this, but
Sure.
I don't want to be labeled as a utilitarian insofar as I don't think that there are real moral values. Whereas a utilitarian would say, like, they would have utils that they would literally add up to figure out, you know what I mean, like what should happen. And I'm not quite like that. I'm not saying that because this will produce more utils, it's immoral to not do it. I'm just saying you're silly if what you want is X and this thing will get you X and then you don't do X.
Right. So
Yeah.
when it comes to utilitarianism, I mean, the reality is that's always a subjective thing. There's no such thing as this utilitarianism without the subjective adherent describing what their version of utilitarianism is. You can easily prove this. Bring together the world's utilitarians in one room, ask them all in a survey, hey, what is your utilitarian outcome? And you'll get a million different things, right? It's not like everyone is of a hive mind there. So in reality, when we're talking about utilitarianism, I'm talking about someone's perceived subjective ends. They have this idea of what they want to see as a goal, and they're willing to say, I'll take whatever I think is getting me to that goal and the consequences thereof. So that's what I'm talking about, when I'm speaking to that. And that is a difference from where I'm at, which is a deontological framing. That means that you have the structure of ethics, right? And the consequences, doesn't matter, because consequences of the ethics that you've grounded, they don't get upended by that. So what that fundamentally, of course, means is that you don't believe it's right to, for example, just a simple example, kill 10,000 people because you think, well, if we kill these 10,000 people, they're a bunch of troublemakers and violent, and we'll save, 1,000,000 people because, well, if I kill 10,000 people, innocent people, just blow them up. Well, then that's better for the world, right? That's where you get to when you get to these outcome-oriented thoughts, instead of saying from the voluntarist perspective that it's unethical to impede on individual rights, that is, bodily property rights, if someone has not themselves initiated force against the body or property of another. And so that is held consistently no matter what. Of course, people will come up with these weird scenarios like, well, what if someone has a nuclear bomb in their basement and they're about to slap a button and all this other stuff?
Yeah.
And talk about that. But in reality, like when we get back to like, okay, what's actually reality here? In reality, if someone were about to do that and you stop them, right, and they were legit gonna, potentially blow up people, of course, there's reasons that you can stop an imminent threat of mass harm, right? There's no such thing as, oh, you have to literally wait until you're shot, before fighting back. Someone who makes an impending actual threat of violence against others, just like someone's at a bar and they're like, I'm gonna kill you, and they're like walking toward you, you're allowed to defend yourself against that manifest threat, in as much as any other situation. But we don't go and make blanket statements and say, well, we have to make, any prevention against property rights for the nature of any perceived security thing in the issue, right? That's where that fundamental idea of people being secure in their bodily property rights comes into play to protect us from mass violence, police states, utilitarian ideas of, well, we need to have something like 1984, The Giver, whatever dystopian thing, or like what's in China right now, where we need a social credit system, because if we can monitor everyone on every street corner, we can make sure nobody ever steals from someone or this or that ever again, that kind of thing. So voluntarism fundamentally rejects that because it is itself acts of violence. And the people who suggest that, oh, well, it's okay, are just saying, well, I'm accepting in my utilitarianism this form of violence, right? It's okay if the police violates the body and property of others, steals from people, puts them in cages, as long as it meets my subjective utilitarian outcome end. Then they just ignore the material violence of what actually happened. And that's kind of like what we have with the government, where, 20th century democide, 262 million deaths is pretty substantial, more than private murders, out of state violence. That is government
sure.
starting all sorts of stuff.
Well, now you're mentioning outcomes though, right? So and
Yes.
then there, like I don't think we're going to disagree on the data, frankly, about how things turn out when you don't follow a voluntarist system.
Right.
I just so excuse me. I just find, like, look, here's my experience with people, and some of this comes from a background in psychology, which is that almost everybody actually wants the same stuff in a broader sense. You only have about like 2%, it varies, of the population that's psychopathic. Almost everybody else, and by the way, society couldn't work otherwise. Like if this was any other way, almost everybody else is social to a varying degree. Does think about other people, thinks about what they want out of society and life and that type of thing. And I don't find that that it will vary in the specifics for sure. Like, I think Slayer is the best band in the world. Somebody else likes, I don't know, who cares, Cyndi Lauper, right? And I'm not going to sit here and go like, well, I get more udals out of Slayer than you do out of Cyndi Lauper, so it's like immoral for you to listen to Cyndi Lauper. Like, I'm not going in that direction. I think I'm going in the direction of just the bare observation that if you really ask people what they want, um, almost every time the voluntarist system, unless the person's a psychopath, will actually be better at delivering it, like without fail. I don't know. What do you want? I want to be a dancer. You want to have cars? Like, do you want to live a life of, Spartan means, where you sit there with like a potted plant and a cup of coffee and that's it? That's all fine. You can do all of that. There's no problem, right? So I often ask myself whether I really need to even go beyond that to just be a voluntarist. I don't know if what do you think? Do I need to buy into the deontological side too, or is that enough?
Yes, you definitely need to buy into it, because it's a psychology that fortifies one's behavior and leads to consistent application of the principles. I would say that when you're talking about people and they have their subjective preferences about what they might like in life, I think that there's plenty of people who might want things for themselves, where it could be, if they were to just say, I need this immediately, could be in a violent form if they wanted to rule others or have some type of wealth, but it didn't come from them working for it. So where we're going in the next level of thinking beyond that is we're reminding people that, yes, you want some things in life, but the question is in the same way that you don't wish to be stolen from, you don't wish to be stabbed,
Sure.
robbed, beaten, barged in the middle of the night where you're sleeping and someone start playing a band or whatever, right? You don't want to do that to others in a reciprocal way, right? If you want to achieve your means and other people have means too that they want, you don't want them achieving their means by violating your body and your property. You want to be secure in those things. And that's irresistible. That is uncontrovertible. You cannot performatively contradict that. It's because, again, you can't want your consent to be violated. So you can't want your body to be battered or robbed, whatever. You can't want the thing that you don't inherently consent to. So that's universal. And that's really what we're focused on here is if everyone has goals in life, as long as they're meeting it within, not stealing from others, murdering others, battering, assaulting, raping, all that good stuff where you're violating the physical body property of others, then we're gravy. And then the only thing left really is, accidents, right? Because someone can trip and fall and bump into someone and hurt them by accident. They don't intend it, but it happens. So once we're moving as a culture toward that end, where people accept that as the cultural norm, the violations go way, way down. The property rights violations go way, way down, and the prosperity goes to the moon. And this is, of course, as not really controversial. When people can be secure in their possessions, when they're not dealing with the losses of destructions and thefts, and they're focused on productivity, then prosperity is going to follow because they're not constantly chasing down the violators and the thieves and the people who are doing non-market things, right? They're not mutually meeting the subjective wants and needs of others because they're just stealing or plundering or destroying. And so that's why that prosperity springs from that respect to consent and property rights.
Yeah, well, okay. So but you started that out by saying, and I kind of like this actually, the deontological buy-in is good for a psychological effect of people just showing them how to behave, which is in itself not to. By the way, one thing I like about you, and I've got this on Facebook, is that you always take things so well. So like if there's a criticism or something, I've never seen you get upset about a genuine criticism or comment. Um, uh, so keep that in mind with what I'm about to say.
Sure.
That sounds like a consequentialist argument, right? Like, well, the deontological thing is useful, so we should probably inculturate, if that's the right word, that to other people, which I think I agree with. Like, I could see that if people walked around thinking it's their duty to be a good voluntarist, things would be better. But I don't want to. No, I just put words in your mouth. So let you respond to that. Is that a like a unintentionally consequentialist argument, or is that just
No, it's
just the
just
way it
simply
is?
both. I'm just describing what is more so. I'm not saying the reason to adopt these is because of the prosperity. Even if there wasn't prosperity at the root, we would have this respect of bodily property rights based on the universality of everyone wanting their consent to be respected, right? And in many cases, some people are not going to be immediately gratified. Think of the murderer who, for themselves, maybe they could murder somebody and they could steal their stuff, hightail it to Mexico, and live out the rest of their days, on a beach, right? For them, they might be like, well, I want to murder because I'm going to benefit, and society sucks and this or that. So I promote that because no matter what, the reciprocity is something that is applicable to everybody universally, and the benefits from that, again, as a consequence, there's no problem with saying that there is a consequence of that, is something that is admirable and makes people feel comfortable adopting those principles. It certainly is not something that is detracting. No one says, yeah, you know what? I really want to be in a place where people are like zombies and they just want to murder, and like half your neighbors are like rummaging through your stuff and they're on top of your roof because they're like animals or something, right? It's very easy to see why that is attractive. And at the end of the day, I am always going to have to talk about positives as well, because people like to hear what the benefits are. Of course, people love to hear why something is good, but there is a fundamental universality to the truths of human behavior. We can look at the is, right? And when we develop further beyond that codes of ethics, we're creating oughts about that behavior, right? About what people performatively do or don't want. And so you could definitely say, well, that's a consequence of seeing that in material reality, certainly, but that's just people appreciating the benefits of the consistent application of the philosophy. So it's not,
Okay,
one or the other. It comes in both in tandem. The benefits are certainly there from applying the philosophy.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. I agree. There's nothing wrong with a deontologist mentioning a positive benefit. That doesn't. It's just it can't be the basis for what the ought is, but it can be certainly a side effect. Now, okay. Let me give you this wild hypothetical, because we brought up the nuclear bombs and all that stuff. All right. So like, and by the way, I want to transfer this into a conversation about culture and affecting culture, right after too. So, let's say there was a computer that, and I know this would have to be a very unrealistic computer, so don't bother pointing that out. Let's say there was a computer that was just smarter than the collective knowledge of human beings in a marketplace, and it could plan out how to achieve everybody, like what everybody wants, better than we can. Because, in a marketplace, sometimes you're wrong. You buy something, it's not, I don't like it as much as I thought it would, that sort of thing, right? We're just imperfect. It's the best system we have. Don't I want every listener to know that, but we're still imperfect. The I would not, in principle, have a problem with this computer providing better way of us being, and sometimes it might be counterintuitive to me, and even be upsetting to me. But if I thought the computer was right, I'd still be rational to follow it, right? I guess uh, I'm just wondering, like, do you see that as being possible to integrate into voluntarism, or is that something that you'd find sort of abhorrent, but as a deontologist, or what are your thoughts about like that type of scenario?
Sure. I mean, there are two problems with that. And there is one that it does tie to the
Yeah,
technology, because there's a big
yeah,
problem, right? So when we talk about free markets and we talk about the nature of human actions, human wants, and human needs, every single person is in a constant flux of making subjective value calculations. They're constantly weighing their pros and cons in any given moment, and it's a totality of information, their localized special knowledge about their resources, time, and preferences. And it's not possible for a machine to literally monitor 7-8 billion people at once and to monitor their real-time preferences.
I told you I know the computer is not realistic.
I know
I
it's
already knew those things.
right, right.
Yeah,
So that fundamentally, and it's just, of course, its own, kind of thing that's just kind
I
of silly.
understand.
That's how come it's so important to recognize that aspect. But let's just say that there was a god computer at this point, right? Because that's what it is.
Yeah.
It's really like a godlike being, where this being knows exactly what every single circumstance, every person. Then it's like, well, what would be the point at that point? Because if to have the act of the machine communicate to the human now is bridging and changing the divide between rational actor and their own ideas versus the influence of the machine. And you get to what's a feedback loop, because essentially if the person is in perfect communication with the machine as the machine is processing and giving back what they think the person should do, that is going to influence the person's decision making. So you would create a logical feedback loop where the machine is telling the person what to think and the person's telling the machine what to think of the person. So you actually have this kind of performative contradiction, really, if the person is actively knowing what the machine wants to do, but then what do they really want if the machine's telling them what to do, and then they follow the machine, right? So if you get it to a kind of a paradox at that point, it would be kind of silly where it's like, wait,
So
the machine knows what I want, but the machine might tell me what I want. How do I know that's what I want? Did I really want that? What if my mind changes now? Then does the machine change to my immediate mind change when I change my mind based on the interaction with the machine? So you have a forever loop on that
yeah.
cycle,
Now
which is
you've already
fundamental.
you've already given your disdain of these sorts of hypotheticals. So I'm gonna
But
let you. I'm gonna let this off the hook a little bit. Normally, so here's what I want to do right now, and I wanted to acknowledge that I'm not going to do this. Is I would just start fixing my scenario to to avoid any of these concerns. But I really don't want to talk about that, and I appreciate that you entertained it at all. What I want to talk about, and this is something I think you're genuinely on the right track about. Not that it's the only thing I think you're on the right track about, but I think in particular, based on things I've seen you say recently, um, you seem like a very positive person. You do these projects where you're trying to get people, like your voluntarist comic book, right? Which is pretty cool looking. I don't know if you want to hold that up or not. That's
oh.
there you go. All
Bubble.
right. Look at that. Yeah,
I love
so this is like a really positive project to undertake.
it.
The unschooling thing, you obviously put a lot of thought into this stuff. It's like, how can I give people resources to change their mind or to strengthen what they already think? You've mentioned, oh, the deontological thing might be as a benefit, maybe not as a base, useful to society, culturally. So I like what you're doing in the like it seems like a really positive way to go about things. However, I've noticed that libertarianism, m- maybe not in particular, but it just like everything else, suffers from this issue where somebody will be a libertarian and they'll notice that if they're angry or if they can make other people angry, they'll gain a following. And then they have like this rational benefit to just keeping people angry instead of helping to change culture. And I'm wondering, like, what do you, and obviously you're doing what you can. What would you like to see happen to change culture for the better for libertarians? And like, is there a way out of this type of thing? I mean, we both know the type of person that I'm talking about. There's more than one example where they get a following and they do it by whatever. It could be defending Donald Trump. And then it's like, well, I'm still a libertarian. It's just that Donald Trump is the best option at the time. I've seen that like a million times from, right? You know what I mean? And it's like, yeah, but okay, well, why are you defending him though? I don't know. Like, that's the what you choose to spend your time doing is a little weird to me if what you want is cultural change. So maybe I'll just leave it there and just what are your thoughts on this mess? Like
Right. So, you know, when it comes to these types of things, everyone has their own individual interests and whatever it is they want to focus on. Fundamentally, you know, if you understand the basics of economics, you know, there's opportunity costs. And so you can't spend your time and resources on one topic without potentially foregoing another, right? If you're talking about one thing, you don't have multiple, you know, voice boxes. You can't talk about the others all at the same time at once. You're going to forego that an opportunity. If you give your dollars to one organization, those dollars are at that organization. So you can't then take the same dollars and give it to another organization. So inherently, resources are scarce, time scarce. You have to pick and choose what it is you're going to focus on. And for a lot of people who are in the public space, the publicity space, they chase the media cycle. And what that means is that they're going to focus on whatever is mainstream by the mainstream big corporate publications and cable news networks and all other stuff, because that gets the most media attention. It's something that if you talk about, you're more likely to get picked up about, you know, if you're staying focused on those things. So for those people, you know, they're going to choose whatever they think gets them more views versus, you know, potentially changing minds and just focusing on those things. And there's cost benefits to this, right? There's a time and a place to talk about mainstream things for the sake of getting attention. But the question then is, when you've captured attention, what are you doing with it past that point, right? It's one thing to capture it. It's another thing to reinforce the status norms or rationalize the status norms. But if you really want a culture change, you have to be the one who's actively educating people. And if you do that, you're going to get flack. That's just the brass tacks. And I know that quite a bit. If you spend the time to push back on status solutions, government solutions, if you push back on mainstream narratives, if you try to get people to get their kids out of state schools and call them prisons, you're going to get people who are like really angry at you because they've been programmed quite literally through trauma-based brainwashing in public schools and in the media. You know, the government is quite intelligent at the brainwashing process, right? This is a very intentional thing with the schooling process. It was created specifically to indoctrinate young people. The government's involvement with the media in Hollywood, CIA has a liaison office, Operation Mockingbird, and all the stuff that they do with, you know, putting in, you know, CIA or deep state narratives and putting in people work for the CIA into news roles. I mean, this is, you know, old news. So the government has, you know, quite the control on many different narratives, and the people who play to those too often, and they forget their opportunity to really do deep education on ethics and property rights and, you know, voluntarism. Those who forget, I think, get quickly wrapped up in the fear-based cycle, because the government and, of course, those in the media want people in a constant state of fear, because if they're in a constant state of fear, then they're more likely to give up their liberties, right? If they're afraid of whatever war, World War III, this government, immigrants, whatever it is, you take your pick. If you're so scared of that, then you're going to demand that government be your savior and protect you and do things right this time. You know, obviously they don't, but you know, you're going to make compromises. And so the government grows on compromise. They don't grow because everybody just supports what the government does all the time in practical reality. They grow because some people are willing to make compromises based on fear at different times, and the government grows here and there in different areas depending on which game they're playing. So those who do engage in the mainstream culture, but who are not doing robust ethics and economics education in tandem with that, are really missing on the goal and the end game and their chance to meaningfully move people toward a principled position. And so fundamentally, if you don't get someone to become principled in terms of thinking outside the state and saying government's not the solution to problems, if you get someone to start playing policy fantasy and saying, well, public schools, maybe they should teach this curriculum instead of that curriculum. Maybe they shouldn't have, this thing versus that thing. Maybe the building should be painted green instead of blue or whatever. You're missing out. You have your opportunity cost of educating people on what should be the ethical goal, which is get your kids out of these brainwashing centers. Stop supporting government violence around the world. Stop all this multi-sided funding. Stop believing the government's going to get it right this time. They're not. The only ethical outcome is getting the government out, because every action of government is based on theft and violence. It's predicated on market distortion, losing all the benefits of those signals in the free market to find out what people really value. And so, the government really survives on getting people to fight each other over managing the tragedy of the commons, that the scarce resources the government is controlling under the guise of the public. And the more government gets people to fight each other over, well, how should we manage this? Should homeless people be allowed here, or where, and it's just like, you're missing it. You're missing the end goal. You forgot. The whole goal is the government's not the solution to the problem. You should be thinking about how to get your kids out, how to get government out, how to cut the theft, how to say, no matter what, I'm not going to support someone who does halfway stuff. Why? Because no matter what, if they're only halfway, the only thing that's going to get through is the statist side of things. It's going to be the government that grows. Even like with Trump, like, oh, well, Trump, he's going to be, really out there fighting the media and the deep state. And what does he do? He keeps them all in. He gets the Space Force, $4 trillion, 2 omnibus spending bills, Operation Warp Speed, promotes the shots for 2 years after. He made some tax cuts initially, undid it with tariffs. He made some good SCOTUS picks. That's probably the best thing, honestly, out of the TPP. Certainly, there's things you could point, oh, he did some good things here. Completely can say that. I could even say, oh, maybe he'd be potentially better than Hillary on some things, for sure. But did you actually move the ball toward liberty? No. He didn't move the ball toward liberty whatsoever.
He didn't even mention it. Like there's not even a part of his platform that had to do with libertarianism at all. Like insofar as this is I guess where I'm this is the frustrating thing. It's like insofar as good things may have happened, they're accidents, right? So why defend a guy that the same people that would defend Donald Trump because, accidentally something good might happen are the same people that get annoyed with like somebody who will defend the UBI, the Universal Basic Income.
Right.
The Universal Basic Income person, they have a rational, like, okay, if we just replaced all of the current social programs with one universal payment, we would save on overhead, and it makes rational sense. And then you'll have the, like a more right-wing libertarian will go, well, yeah, but that's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is like it's going to get added on top of the other stuff, and you're not looking at the world in like in a realistic way over there. And it's like, yeah, but it's the exact same argument. Like, why? It's the exact same problem. And now I agree with you on this, but like I also think you're doing the same thing over here. But I feel like the argument that they'll always give back, and I'm not thinking about one in particular person, although I know you just experienced this stupid argument, is, well, yeah, but more people listen to me. Like, and it's like, yeah, but they're listening to shit. Why do you want that? Why do you want that? Like, it doesn't. I would rather have 10 people change their mind in an informed, reasonable way. Like I had John Murphy on. I don't know if you know him. He's an economics professor, and the two of us basically talked for 10 or 15 minutes about how Don Boudreaux, another econ professor from GMU, this was from my point of view. I don't put words in John's mouth. It made me a like less angry, more reasonable young man by reading his economics work and learning that, like, oh yeah, okay, you're upset about purchasing power, but don't forget the stuff in the Sears catalog from 1968. You would have had to work 5 weeks to afford that, where now like you work 3 hours. So okay, maybe central banking is bad, but remember also there's good force of capitalism over here, and now there's like a rational discussion. right? So what can we do to keep it in that realm instead of this, like, well, you know, like basically Howard Stern radio, where it's like, I'm just going to say something outrageous just so you listen to me, and that's really my goal. I almost feel like there needs to be some kind of acknowledgement from some part of libertarianism that that is just shameful. Like, I don't know. I'll leave you. What do you think? How do we stop that type of thing from happening?
Sure. I think that, when it comes to shock jockeying and being outrageous, to be outrageous is to outrage the statists. That should be the goal. If you're going to make somebody mad, get the statists mad. Be so principled for liberty and don't give socialists an inch like Javier Milei did. That's what I like to do when it comes to, big topic issues. I'll go up against David Hogg or whoever else and make some pithy quote or some statement that shows hypocrisy or shows, a lie or something like that. It's about trying to wake up and shake up people in the mainstream through radical principles, radical to them, normal to us, but nonetheless, something that's jarring, something they're not used to seeing. And so, I think that that's been a big point for people's, compromising their fear is they lose the sense that their words can affect change to others, and that change can have a positive aspect for liberty. Again, people say, okay, whoa, wait, I didn't know about that thing that the government did, or I didn't know about this violence, or, oh, that's a good point about, the trade-offs when it comes to what government's doing and how they're spending things on war and stuff like that, right? Versus, well, I'm going to compromise and I'm going to say, man, maybe the government can do this thing right. And it's just so frustrating to see homeless people in the public parks and all this stuff. You haven't made anybody more principled by that. If anything, you're just communicating to people, hey, you know what? Maybe you should vote for the mainstream candidate on this single issue thing and hope that they don't screw up everything else where they are completely unprincipled. And it's just, we've seen that time and again, that if someone doesn't have those consistent principles, you could expect the worst. Maybe they might do that one good thing. It's possible. And then they'll do 10 horrible things to undo that. So it's like, it's the same kind of things that, with trade-offs. And I tell people about this all the time. I'm like, people can have preferences in their status. And some people say, well, I'd rather be at a place that has better gun rights. Some people are like, I want to be at a place that has better business climate or has a better, cannabis legalization. You can play the trade-offs game all you want, but you're not getting the true liberty if you're not actually cutting the size, scope, power of the state and getting people outside of those systems. You're not doing things that get people less dependent on government and more into the free market and of course, peaceable, healthy economic signals. So that's why, when you look at what someone's actually doing, you have to walk through the empirical reality and not get lost in the hyperbole and the fantasy policy, right? When someone's just a shock jock podcast is that, are they running for office? No. Do they control the presidency? No. Are they head of border patrol? No. Are they the sheriff? No. Are they a billionaire and they're going to, fund Congress a certain way to manipulate them? No, they're not Speaker of the House. They're just talking on the internet. And that's it. And you're going to get people do one of several things, right? They're either going to take more steps to get themselves out of the status matrix, or they're going to be like, nah, I just want to vote for the lesser two evils. And, the borders issue or this issue is, too important. So most important election of my lifetime, boom, vote for the next status candidate who's going to just grow the police state. Or, someone's like, I mentioned this on a show the other day, someone who is evangelical, they're really against abortion. They may have voted for Bush, and they're like, oh, see, he's real pro-life, right? And then it's like, okay, and now they're going to go create a war and kill a bunch of kids overseas, right? Yeah. So you can play the game, the single issues game all day long.
Sure.
Don't forget what happens when they go and do the opposite of what you want in just a different context, because they're not principled. They're not there for actual human liberty and respect of property rights. So I just like to bring it back to reality. When you're listening to someone's podcast, is a big posture. Who are you actually in control of? What's your actual sphere of influence? What are you actually going to do with your life? Are you just going to check a box on a ballot and that's the end of it? Are you running for office? Where are you applying yourself? And if you're not meaningfully applying yourself anyway, then you're just virtue signaling, like anybody who puts a flag in bio. You're not actually changing anything. It'd be one thing if you're like, okay, I'm going to start an issue organization, really focus on this issue or something like that. But if you're not, then you're just shock jockeying and you just want to get followers so people come pay to listen to your paywalled show or come see you at a comedy show or this or that. You're not actually helping people to say, you know what, the state is evil. Like, I want to literally break it down as much as I can and get the government control out of my life, get my kids out of school, whatever it takes. You haven't created that backdrop psychology, and people can't consistently act if they don't have a consistent framework, because they're going to sit there and make exceptions every time. They'll say, well, this one issue, it's too important, I'm going to make an exception. Oh, this issue, too important, I'm going to make an exception. By the time you're done with your exceptions, you have a government that's $34 trillion in debt and a police state. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, so like I want to go back to something you said about, hey, if you're going to make anybody angry, why don't you make like a statist angry? And I don't really, I guess, have a problem with that statement. I think if anybody is going to be angry, okay, fine, I agree. But like even better to me, and maybe this is just my Canadian side of me. It's just it would be even better if nobody was angry and we just became more rational. And I don't know a ton about Javier Milei, but I have listened to a little bit about a little bit of what he said. I listened to a 20-minute speech from him the other day, and I actually was struck by how not angry it was. I actually thought he was going to be a lot angrier, and he wasn't. He was going on about um, what are what they've experienced in Argentina, what uh, uh, economics literature said. He was literally going into economics literature in a speech, and not in a like weird Putin way, like in the 9th century, whatever. No, I mean like he's just explaining basic modern economic concepts and explaining why what he is saying makes rational sense. And I know he has a reputation for being, a bit charismatic, which is fine. He's got the look about him, and I don't know what else he has said, but I was actually impressed by how just reasonable he was. And it's not the type of speech you'd ever hear from a Western politician, like from the United States, the UK, Canada, whatever. It was much deeper than that. But I started thinking maybe the way that he can get maybe the way he can get away with this and be politically successful is just that in his country, people are so fed up with the way they're living that maybe they're finally ready to listen to reason, right? And I feel like what any contribution that the type of person that just wants to collect angry followers and whip them up is doing, if there's anything positive about it, it's just that they might eventually make people so fed up, make things so bad that finally people are willing to listen to reason after 100 years of misery. Right? Like that's not good. Like that's not anyway, just I want to put that out there. Not, I mean, just in case anybody hears this and they feel like that they should be listening to somebody that whose primary goal is to make people angrier. I think again, make people more rational. But you know what? I'll let you get the last word in here because we're going over an hour now. So
Yeah, it's all good. Yeah, I think that when it comes to anger, there's justified anger when it relates to ethical harms. And I think that when we're talking about what people should be angry over, they should be angry over the violence of the state. And Javier Milei did get angry when it came to denouncing the violence and theft of the socialist Peronist government. So it's not that anger doesn't have a place. The question is just, what are you doing with that anger? Are you channeling it toward a meaningful, consistent critique of the government and getting people to be rational when they realize, wow, this is how the government's screwing me? Okay, I'm mad at what the government's doing. They're completely destroying my future, my children's future. They're brainwashing them to become socialists. That should make you angry. And then you got to say, okay, now what? What am I going to do that consistently gets us out of that paradigm? So I agree with you there that anger alone doesn't solve it, but anger can stir someone's thought process. And it should be, if you want to have a consistent principled future, toward reason and evidence about the nature of statism, economics, ethics, and the reality of what's going on. So the anger, when I say getting status angry, the anger should be coming from exposing what the government is doing with them and their money, exposing how the government is robbing us blind with inflation and saying, are you not frustrated? You can't afford to feed your kids because prices are up 30, 50%. That should cause some anger. Now, guess what? Guess where this is coming from? It's not coming from greedy corporations. It's not because, oh, suddenly, the greed index has gone up and down. No, the government printed money and they locked everyone down. They shut down their businesses and they caused everyone to go into chaos. And the government's actions and their force and their violence and their theft, that is why you are suffering now. Do not ask for more government. Government will continue to rob you blind. That is the channeling of that anger into a reasoned discourse and getting people to see the truth. And I think if we get there, no matter what the angle is, if we get down to, as you're saying, getting people to think, then that is a long-term victory, right? Not just the emotional reactivity, but a long-term oriented thought process about the nature of state action, what's actually being done, and realizing that government is not the solution to our problems. You got to think outside the state.
All right, there we go. Okay. Anything else you want to plug before I say goodbye to everybody?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, just real quick,
Go for it.
kids campaign is wrapping up actually on Thursday, so I don't know if people see it, but it is available on Amazon, so you can look up the Unschooled Adventures of Jack Lloyd on Amazon. And if you want to check out my work otherwise and just see what we got going on, we got music videos. We'll be doing some other cool stuff coming up. You can go to Jack, Jack, V is in voluntarist, Jack V Lloyd, LLOYD, so jackvlloyd.com. From there, you can check out a bunch of other things that we do, because we produce all kinds of content. Me and my wife, the philosopher, educational videos, economics videos, skits, fun ways to engage the culture and get people to think outside the state. So that's my hope for everybody. They're able to consistently think outside of government solutions and move toward a voluntary order.
All right, perfect. And I'll make sure to link to all that stuff when this goes live. So, not live, when it goes up. All right. Thank you very much, and we'll see everybody at the next episode.